A young clerk in New York City, sometime in the 1850s, climbs the front steps of a house he does not own, on a street where half the doors look almost exactly alike. He is 23 years old, maybe 24. He has come from upstate New York, or Connecticut, or rural Pennsylvania, or Ireland, or Germany, or one of the small towns now feeding young men into the offices, shops, warehouses, and counting rooms of the city. He has 2 shirts, 1 good coat, a pair of boots that need repair, a letter of introduction folded in his pocket, and not nearly enough money to rent a home of his own. The woman who opens the door is not his relative. She is not his employer. She is not, in any legal sense, responsible for him. But tonight she will give him a bed. Tomorrow morning she will give him breakfast. Tomorrow evening she will give him dinner at a table where 6 or 8 or 12 other people, none of them related to one another, will sit close enough to hear each other chew. For this he will pay by the week. Not rent exactly, not hotel fare exactly, room and board. A bed upstairs, a place at the table downstairs, and the uneasy privilege of living inside a stranger's household as if he were almost, but never completely, part of the family. This arrangement once housed millions of Americans, not a handful of drifters, not only the poor, not only men without prospects, clerks boarded, teachers boarded, widows boarded, immigrants boarded, traveling salesmen boarded, young women who worked in shops and offices boarded, factory hands boarded, black political delegates boarded when white hotels would not receive them, married couples boarded before they could afford to keep house, old people boarded when the work of maintaining a private home became too much. By the late 19th century, Americans boarded at a scale that is difficult to imagine now. Historians estimate that in many cities, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of urban residents either lived as boarders or took boarders into their homes. Some contemporary observers suggested that in Manhattan, as many as 3/4 of adults had lived in a boarding house at some point in their lives. The numbers are imprecise because the census categories were imprecise. Boarders, lodgers, relatives, servants, and household members often blurred together in the paperwork. But the scale is not in doubt. 19th century America was, in the words often attributed to Walt Whitman, a boarding people. And then, almost completely, it stopped being one. The boarding house did not disappear because Americans suddenly became wealthier, cleaner, safer, or more private by nature. It disappeared because the definition of home changed around it. Apartments, residential hotels, zoning laws, automobiles, suburban mortgages, and the single-family ideal all did their part. Reformers and middle-class homeowners helped too, by teaching Americans to see the boarding house not as ordinary housing, but as a threat to the proper home. The story of the boarding house is the story of a country that once treated the household as flexible, crowded, commercial, and communal, and then spent the 20th century trying to make it private, separated, regulated, and sealed. It begins, as so many American housing stories do, with a room that could not hold everyone who needed to sleep in it. The first thing to understand about a boarding house is that it was not simply a cheap hotel. A hotel rented rooms, a lodging house rented beds, a boarding house rented a place in a household. That distinction mattered. A boarder did not merely sleep under the roof. He or she ate there. The meals were part of the arrangement: breakfast in the morning, dinner in the evening, sometimes supper, sometimes Sunday dinner depending on the house, the city, the price, and the landlady's rules. The phrase was room and board, and the second half of the phrase was what made the arrangement intimate. The boarding house table was the center of the system, not the bedroom, not the parlor, the table. At that table, the house became something stranger than a family and something warmer than a business. A landlady might own the house, lease the house, or simply rent part of it and take in others to make the arithmetic work. Boarders might be young men from the countryside, women working in the city, immigrant cousins newly arrived, widows, clerks, teachers, mechanics, shopgirls, apprentices, or older people who had outlived the households they once belonged to. They came down the stairs at set hours. They took their seats. They ate what was served. They learned who talked too much, who took more than his share, who had lost work, who had a caller, who had not paid on time, who had come home late, and who was pretending not to notice. The table fed them. It also watched them. This was the central bargain. In a boarding house, a person could arrive in a city with almost nothing and become attached immediately to a domestic system. There was a roof. There was cooked food. There was a bed. There were rules. There were other people who might know the name of the factory hiring that week, or the shop needing a clerk, or the church that took in newcomers, or the woman down the hall whose cousin had married well and knew of a position. Boarding made cities work because it absorbed people before the city had any other place to put them. In the 1830s and 1840s, American cities were growing faster than private housing could adjust. New York and Boston saw rising real estate prices and growing populations of single workers and transient laborers. Commercial life expanded. Wage labor expanded. Young people left farms and small towns. Immigrants arrived by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands. Industrial districts needed workers, but workers needed somewhere to sleep within reach of the job. The private single-family home, the kind later Americans would treat as the natural form of domestic life, was not available to most of these people. The boarding house was. It took the ordinary house and stretched it. A spare bedroom became income. An attic room became income. A parlor became semi-public. A dining room became a business operation. A woman's cooking became a revenue stream. A household became a market. This is what made the boarding house so important and so troubling at the same time. It turned home into something Americans claimed to value and fear in equal measure, a business. Picture the house before the boarders wake. It is still dark. The stove has to be lit. Coffee has to be made. Bread has to be sliced. Eggs, if there are eggs, have to be rationed. Meat, if there is meat, has to be stretched across more plates than the butcher would have recommended. In some houses, the morning meal is plain but decent. In others, it is a kind of culinary negotiation between hunger, pride, and cost. The landlady knows the numbers. She knows what the room brings in by the week. She knows what coal costs. She knows what flour costs. She knows which boarder eats too much. She knows which boarder is late with payment but has always caught up before. She knows which girl in the upstairs room is respectable enough to keep and which visitor is going to cause gossip if he stays 1 minute too long in the parlor. The landlady is often described in cartoons and jokes as fussy, cheap, suspicious, or tyrannical. The jokes are easy because the position invited resentment. She controlled the food. She controlled the rules. She decided whether a boarder could stay. She might water the soup, stretch the meat, scold the latecomer, and count every slice. But the caricature hides the difficulty of the work. Keeping boarders was one of the few ways a married woman, widow, or older single woman could turn domestic labor into cash without leaving the home. For some households, boarders made the difference between keeping the house and losing it. In others, the landlady's income was more reliable than her husband's wages. If a man's work was irregular, if a husband died, if children needed support, if a mortgage or rent payment had to be met, the spare room became a financial instrument. The house itself became the business. But unlike a shop, it never closed. Breakfast had to be ready before work. Dinner had to be ready when boarders returned. Beds had to be made. Floors had to be scrubbed. Laundry had to be managed. Fires had to be maintained. Coal had to be carried. Accounts had to be kept. Complaints had to be handled before they became departures. The food had to be cheap, enough to keep the margins alive and good enough to keep the reputation alive. A bad meal could become a rumor. A dirty room could cost a boarder. A scandal could ruin the house. The landlady was not merely cooking, she was managing a fragile economy made out of food, reputation, beds, manners, and trust. Every chair at the table had a price attached to it. Every empty chair was a threat. This is why boarding house keeping could be remembered as one of the cruelest and most thankless ways a woman could make a living. It turned the work women were already expected to do into paid work without giving it the dignity of a profession. Reformers worried about the morals of boarders, satirists mocked the meals, neighbors judged the house, boarders complained about the rules, but the woman running it had to make the numbers work by Monday. That is the part the boarding house nostalgia forgets. A cozy table is only cozy for the people sitting down. For the woman standing behind it, it is inventory. By the middle of the 19th century, boarding was not a fringe arrangement. It was part of ordinary urban life. Writers noticed it because it was everywhere. Thomas Butler Gunn's The Physiology of New York Boarding Houses cataloged the city's boarding house world with the obsessive pleasure of a man watching a society sort itself by food, furniture, price, manners, and ambition. There were cheap boarding houses, fashionable boarding houses, theatrical boarding houses, houses full of clerks, houses with marriageable daughters, houses where the food was the point, houses where the company was the point, houses where nobody stayed longer than necessary. New York had no single boarding house world. It had dozens. The arrangement fit a city in motion. A young man did not need to marry before he moved to the city. A young woman working in a shop or office could find a supervised house that made her independence appear respectable. An immigrant could stay with people who spoke the same language and cooked familiar food. A widow could avoid living entirely alone. A traveling professional could remain mobile without giving up every domestic comfort. The boarding house was temporary, but the temporariness was part of its usefulness. It was the housing of people not yet settled, not yet married, not yet prosperous, not yet sure where work would take them, not yet ready or able to keep house. That phrase appears again and again in the period, keep house. To keep house meant to establish an independent domestic unit, a wife, a husband, furniture, a kitchen, children perhaps, privacy, responsibility, a home that was not also someone else's business. But many Americans lived for years before reaching that point. Some never reached it. Some did not want it. Some could not afford it. Some preferred the sociability of boarding. Some used it while saving money. Some used it because they had no choice. The boarding house stood between the hotel and the family home, between independence and dependence, between privacy and exposure, between the market and the household. It was useful because it was in between, and that is exactly why critics distrusted it. Dinner was the main performance. The boarders came in from the city, the clerk from the insurance office, the mechanic from the shop, the school teacher, the shop girl, the salesman passing through for 2 weeks, the widow who had the back room on the second floor, the young man who wanted everyone to know he had been promoted, the young woman whose visitor last Sunday had already become the subject of half the house's attention. They sat down at the same table. They ate family style. The food depended on the house. Some tables were generous, some were barely adequate. Some became famous for economy disguised as cooking. Boarders' beef, stew, hash, bread, coffee, potatoes, beans, whatever could be stretched, reheated, seasoned, and made respectable enough to serve again. The meal was nourishment, but it was also an examination. Who arrived late? Who took too much? Who spoke well? Who flirted? Who stayed silent? Who had a new coat? Who looked ill? Who had not received a letter in 3 weeks? In a private home, embarrassment could be contained by family. In a boarding house, embarrassment traveled around the table before dessert. This constant observation could be warm. Boarders formed friendships, they helped one another find work, they loaned money, they shared newspapers, they introduced cousins, sisters, and future spouses. They joined family outings, played cards in the parlor, listened to music, debated politics, and built the kind of small daily intimacy that modern people often associate with roommates but with a stricter and more domestic frame. But the same closeness could become suffocating. A boarder had a room, but not a full private life. A landlady knew hours. Other boarders knew habits. The house knew who came in late, who left early, who argued, who drank, who courted, who was dismissed from work, who had fallen behind in payment. Home was not a refuge from scrutiny. Home was where scrutiny took its most personal form. This was the emotional shape of boarding, belonging and exposure together. A boarder was not alone. That was the comfort. A boarder was never fully unseen. That was the cost. Chapter 5. Women who could leave home, but not judgment. For single working women, the boarding house could be a door into the city. By the late 19th century, increasing numbers of women were working as clerks, stenographers, teachers, shop assistants, factory employees, and office workers. Many were unmarried. Many had left family homes. Many needed housing that allowed them to live near work without destroying their reputations. Boarding houses offered that possibility, but never without supervision. A respectable boarding house for women had rules: hours, visitors, dress, parlor behavior, meals, church attendance in some cases. A young woman could live independently but only inside a structure that reassured the outside world she was being watched. Reformers and women's organizations established boarding homes for working women precisely because freedom had to be wrapped in respectability before the public would tolerate it. This was the contradiction. The boarding house allowed women to earn wages, live away from parents, delay marriage, and enter public life. It also treated that independence as a moral risk requiring constant management. A male boarder who stayed out late might be seen as irresponsible. A female boarder who stayed out late could become a scandal. The parlor became the place where courtship could occur without becoming too private. Suitors could visit but not go upstairs. Conversation could happen but under eyes. A landlady could permit, discourage, or end a relationship by deciding who was allowed to call and how long he was allowed to stay. The boarding house gave women mobility. It also gave other people a claim on interpreting that mobility. For the landlady, the stakes were just as high. One rumor about the wrong kind of visitors could damage the whole house. Respectability was not abstract, it was income. A house with a bad reputation lost good boarders and attracted boarders who made the reputation worse. So the landlady became both businesswoman and moral officer, protecting her residents, her livelihood, and her own standing at the same time. This is one reason boarding houses were so often discussed with anxiety. They made women's lives more economically flexible while exposing the fiction that the private home had ever been purely private. The respectable household was now taking payment from strangers. The respectable young woman was living among unrelated adults. The respectable landlady was running a business from her dining room. The home had become porous, and a porous home made reformers nervous. Chapter 6. Immigrant houses, black houses, working houses. No single boarding house can stand for all of them. That is the next thing to understand. In one neighborhood, a boarding house might be a respectable middle-class home where clerks and teachers sat at a polished table under the landlady's eye. In another, it might be an immigrant house where newcomers found language, food, advice, and someone who knew which factory was hiring. In a railroad district, it might be crowded, loud, and temporary. In a mill town, it might be connected directly to an employer's discipline. In a black neighborhood, it might be one of the few safe places where travelers, delegates, and organizers could sleep when hotels refused them. The immigrant boarding house was often invisible to outsiders except as a problem. Reformers saw crowding, Inspectors saw sanitation concerns. Neighbors saw unfamiliar smells, unfamiliar languages, unfamiliar customs. But inside the house, those same features could mean survival. The soup on the stove was not merely food, it was memory. The language at the table was not failure to assimilate, it was relief. A newcomer who could not yet read the city could find work, kin, church, synagogue, mutual aid, and instruction from the people already sitting at the table. The boarding house was often the first American institution an immigrant entered that was not the dock, the factory, or the police station. It could exploit, it could overcrowd, it could overcharge, but it could also protect. Black boarding houses carried a different kind of burden. In a segregated country, lodging was never neutral. A black traveler could not assume a hotel room. A delegate to a political convention could not assume safety. Black boarding housekeepers provided food, beds, and meeting space in cities where the formal hospitality economy was often closed or hostile. Houses connected to the colored conventions movement and other black civic networks were not merely places to sleep. They were infrastructure for organizing. Politics needs rooms, movements need tables, people traveling under threat need doors that will open. The boarding house supplied those things, often without the recognition given to halls, churches, newspapers, and leaders. It made political life possible by solving the smaller, more immediate problem of where someone could safely eat and sleep that night. The company boarding house solved a different problem: labor supply. In mill towns and industrial districts, employers sometimes sponsored or controlled boarding houses near factories. Workers gained proximity, meals, and a predictable place to stay. The employer gained discipline. The house could extend the logic of the factory into domestic life. Hours, behavior, morality, and dependency all became part of the arrangement. A boarding house could be mutual aid. It could be surveillance. It could be exploitation. It could be refuge. It could be all four in the same week. Chapter 7. The Low End. The romantic version of the boarding house usually stops at the table. The real story has to go upstairs. In better houses, boarders had private rooms, decent beds, clean linens, and enough space to feel that they were merely sharing a household, not being stored in one. In poorer houses, privacy shrank. Rooms were subdivided, beds were shared, workers on different shifts could use the same bed at different hours. These were the so-called hotbeds, mattresses used so continuously that one body had barely left before another lay down. The phrase is almost too vivid to need explanation. A hotbed was not a metaphor. It was housing reduced to the minimum interval between exhaustion and work. In industrial districts, near railroad shops, factories, docks, mines, and mills, this kind of arrangement met the needs of a labor economy that did not care whether workers had homes in any deeper sense. A man working nights could sleep while another worked days. A room could earn twice. A landlord could compress human life into schedules rather than space. This was not the whole boarding house world, but it was part of it. Bedbugs, theft, bad food, poor ventilation, sickness, noise, and petty scams belong to the darker edge of the system. A boarder could be cheated, a landlady could be ruined by unpaid bills, a young woman could be preyed upon, a drunk could disturb the whole house, a fire could move through a crowded building before anyone had time to reach the stairs. The boarding house was not a lost paradise. It was a housing system built under pressure, and pressure produces compromises. That's why the critics had material to work with. When moralists described boarding houses as dens of vice or nests of crime, they were often exaggerating ordinary mixed living into panic. But they were not inventing every danger from nothing. The boarding house really did blur boundaries. It really did put unrelated men and women near one another. It really did make privacy difficult. It really did create opportunities for exploitation. It really did trouble the ideal of the home as a protected family world. The mistake was not noticing the danger. The mistake was treating the whole system as the danger. because the same system that housed the vulnerable was then blamed for vulnerability itself. That confusion would matter later when reformers and lawmakers began deciding what kinds of households should be allowed to exist. Chapter 8. The House That Respectability Could Not Forgive. By the late 19th century, the boarding house had become too common to ignore and too ambiguous to love. Middle-class Americans were building a new domestic ideal around the private nuclear family. A proper home in this vision was occupied by a husband, wife, and children. The home was separate from the market, the wife managed it, the husband earned outside it, the children were raised inside it. Strangers did not sleep upstairs. Paying customers did not sit at breakfast. Courtship was supervised but not commercialized. Food was served to family, not sold by the plate. The boarding house contradicted almost every part of that ideal. It put money inside the home. It put strangers inside the family routine. It gave women economic roles that were neither fully domestic nor fully public. It allowed single adults to live outside the standard path of marriage and housekeeping. It mixed classes, occupations, ethnicities, and genders in ways that seemed disorderly to people trying to make urban neighborhoods predictable. It made home less pure. That was the unforgivable part. The boarding house had helped make city growth possible, but it also became the thing against which the respectable home defined itself. The private home looked more private when placed beside the boarding house. The single-family house looked more moral when placed beside the mixed household. The quiet parlor looked more respectable when placed beside the boarding house table. By the 1880s and 1890s, reformers, homeowners, and municipal authorities increasingly treated boarding houses not as ordinary infrastructure, but as a problem to be managed. The language of concern could sound humane: sanitation, safety, morality, overcrowding, protection of young women, prevention of crime. Some of those concerns were real, but behind them was another concern less often stated plainly. The boarding house made the city socially porous. And many people wanted the city less porous. They wanted neighborhoods sorted by family type, class, race, and respectability. They wanted streets of private homes, not houses whose front doors opened to unknown adults coming and going at all hours. They wanted property values protected. They wanted the household removed from the market, except when the market was the mortgage itself. This is where the story turns. The boarding house began as an answer to a housing shortage. By the early 20th century, it was being redefined as evidence that a neighborhood had failed. Chapter 9. From Boarding to Rooming. The decline did not happen in one clean step. First, the table weakened. By the 1920s and 1930s, many tenants preferred lodging without meals. They wanted privacy, flexibility, and fewer obligations to a household. Landlords often preferred this too. Feeding boarders was hard, managing a quasi-family was harder, renting rooms without meals reduced labor and emotional entanglement. The rooming house grew where the boarding house had been. A rooming house could offer a bed, perhaps a small stove or gas burner, sometimes a sink, sometimes access to shared bathrooms, sometimes what was called light housekeeping. The resident no longer had to appear at the table. The landlady no longer had to serve dinner. The shared household loosened into a building of separate lives stacked under one roof. This was modern in a specific way. Less intimate, less supervised, more anonymous, more private in some respects, lonelier in others. The shift from boarding to rooming tells the larger story of American domestic life. The old boarding house had turned strangers into a kind of temporary household. The rooming house let strangers remain strangers. It reduced the burden of sociability. It also reduced the social support. Residential hotels offered a higher status version of the same movement. In downtown districts, people could rent rooms with services, dining options, lounges, and staff without entering the emotional economy of a landlady's table. For some residents, this was liberation. For others, it was simply the next stage in the commercialization of home. Apartments also changed the equation. A self-contained flat, even a small one, offered a family or individual something boarding could not: a door that closed on a unit of life arranged as one's own. A private kitchen, however small, a private schedule, a private set of quarrels, a private smell of dinner. Privacy became the luxury people wanted, and then the standard they expected. The boarding house did not vanish because everyone suddenly could afford comfort. It lost ground because the culture decided that sharing a household with unrelated adults was a lower form of living. Once that judgment hardened, law followed. Chapter 10. The law enters the house. Zoning did not merely organize buildings, it organized moral assumptions. Beginning in the early 20th century and intensifying after World War II, zoning codes and occupancy rules increasingly restricted how many unrelated adults could live in a dwelling, where boarding houses could operate, and what kinds of residential arrangements counted as acceptable in single-family districts. Boarding and rooming houses were pushed into marginal zones, treated as non-conforming uses, or subjected to requirements that made small-scale operation difficult. The law learned to prefer the private family. A house with parents and children was normal. A house with 6 unrelated working adults was suspicious. A widow renting spare rooms might be treated as a problem for neighbors. A group of low-wage workers sharing space might be treated as a threat to property values. A boarding house in a single-family district could become a violation before it became a crime. This is one of the quietest ways a housing system disappears. Not by bulldozer, not by fire, not by one dramatic closing. It disappears through definitions. Who counts as a family? How many unrelated people may share a kitchen? What kind of house may serve meals? Which streets may contain rented rooms? Which uses are permitted? Which uses are grandfathered until the owner dies or sells? Which repairs trigger compliance costs the owner cannot afford? The boarding house had always depended on flexibility. The law increasingly made flexibility illegal. Post-war suburbanization finished the work culturally. The federal mortgage system, highway construction, mass home building, and the rising ideal of owner-occupied single-family life pushed Americans toward a different domestic model. The respectable adult was supposed to move through life in a sequence: childhood home, perhaps temporary lodging, marriage, private home, suburban stability. Boarding, especially prolonged boarding, began to look like failure. The country that had once needed boarding houses to absorb mobile workers now treated shared living as a sign that something had gone wrong, and when that happened, the bottom rung of the housing ladder began to break. Chapter 11. What was lost? When the table disappeared. It is tempting to say that America simply moved on to better housing. In some ways, it did. Many boarding houses were crowded, many lacked privacy, some were exploitative, some were dangerous, some deserved regulation. Many people who left them for apartments or single-family homes experienced that move as an improvement so obvious it required no defense. A private kitchen mattered, a private bathroom mattered, a bedroom not shared with strangers mattered, the ability to eat without being watched mattered. The ability to come home late without a landlady judging the hour mattered. The modern private home solved real problems. But it did not only solve them, it eliminated a form of low-cost housing that had made mobility possible for people who did not yet have families, savings, stable work, or the desire to live alone. It removed a flexible option from the market. It made the household less adaptable. It pushed people toward either full privacy, if they could afford it, or institutional and marginal housing if they could not. By the late 20th century in some places, rooming house stock declined by more than 90%. That number is not just a statistic about buildings. It is a measure of doors that stopped opening, small rooms gone, cheap beds gone, weekly arrangements gone, landladies gone, tables gone, informal housing economies gone. The people who once might have boarded did not disappear. The young worker still arrived. The old widow still needed company. The immigrant still needed a first address. The person between jobs still needed a room cheaper than an apartment. The person who could not pass a modern rental application still needed somewhere to sleep. What disappeared was one of the ordinary private systems that had once absorbed them. After the boarding house declined, the same need reappeared under other names: single-room occupancy hotels, informal rentals, group homes, shelters, co-living, illegal basement units, roommate arrangements, short-term rentals, residential hotels, subsidized housing, and, for too many people, no housing at all. The boarding house had not solved poverty, but it had been one of the ways poverty, mobility, age, widowhood, migration, and single adulthood could fit into the city without requiring a full private apartment. When that form was stigmatized, regulated, and removed, America did not become more moral. It became less flexible. Chapter 12. The Return of the Stranger's House. Today, the boarding house returns disguised. It returns as co-living. It returns as shared housing. It returns as micro-apartments with common kitchens. It returns as student housing, workforce housing, group homes, long-term Airbnb rooms, informal immigrant lodging, and arguments over accessory dwelling units. It returns because the old problem never went away. Cities still attract people faster than they house them. Young workers still need cheap rooms. Older people still need companionship. Immigrants still rely on networks. Single adults still outnumber the assumptions built into zoning codes. People still need housing that is more flexible than the private single-family home and less institutional than a shelter. The strange part is that modern America often treats these arrangements as new. They are not new. They are echoes. The boarding house was doing this work in the 1840s. It was doing it in New York, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, mill towns, railroad centers, and boom towns. It was doing it for clerks, widows, shopgirls, immigrants, black travelers, factory hands, and people whose lives did not yet fit the private household ideal. What has changed is the language. A boarding house was once suspicious because it mixed home and market. Now co-living is marketed because it mixes home and market with better branding. A landlady once stretched a stew to feed 12 people and was mocked for doing it. A modern company can rent furnished bedrooms around a shared kitchen and call it innovation. The arrangement changes costumes. The need remains. This is the inversion the boarding house would not have anticipated. The form once dismissed as morally suspect, crowded, old-fashioned, and socially dangerous now reappears in expensive cities as a solution to loneliness and unaffordability. Shared meals become community programming, common rooms become amenities, house rules become resident agreements. The stranger's house becomes a lifestyle product. But the older question is still underneath it. Who is allowed to share a home? Who is allowed to make money from spare rooms? Who is allowed to live outside the nuclear family without being treated as a problem? Who gets community and who gets surveillance? Who gets affordable housing and who gets regulated out of existence? The boarding house matters because it shows that American domestic life was never as private, pure, or self-contained as later memory pretended. Millions of people built their lives in houses where the family was partly real, partly rented, partly chosen, and partly endured. The old boarding house is mostly gone now. The table is gone. The landlady's ledger is gone. The parlor rules are gone. The hotbeds, thankfully, are mostly gone too. The houses themselves may still stand, converted back to single-family homes, divided into apartments, restored as historic properties, or demolished without anyone remembering how many lives once passed through their rooms. But the question that built them is still here. What does a city do with people who need a place to live before they can afford a home? In the 19th century, one answer was simple. A stranger opened the door. There was a bed upstairs, there was a place at the table, there were rules, there was gossip, there was food that might not be good enough and company that might be too close, and a landlady who knew too much. It was not freedom. It was not privacy. It was not always safe, fair, clean, or kind, but it was a rung on the ladder, and for millions of Americans, for nearly a century, it was home. That is the boarding house, a business pretending to be a family charging by the week, a table full of strangers who knew exactly what time you came home, and one of the most important American housing systems we almost completely forgot.